Hi everyone, hope you're doing well. This video is on the Old Testament and the life of the church. So the first topic we're going to address is the use of the Old Testament in worship, and we'll do a quick historical overview. The Old Testament was definitely part of early Christian worship, at least for sure in some areas. For example, Justin Martyr, who was writing from Rome in about 150 AD, discusses what they do on Sunday morning, and part of what they do is they read from the writings of the prophets. So we assume that these are probably something from the prophetic books of the Old Testament that are read in worship. There seems to have been, though, some initial controversy about the role of the Old Testament both in worship and in Christianity in general. So you may have heard of a guy by the name of Marcion, who is actually slightly earlier from Justin Martyr, and he thought that basically the Bible should only contain the Gospel according to Luke and the writings of Paul. In other words, he campaigned for just leaving out the Old Testament altogether. He said, if you're not Jewish, we don't worship a Jewish God, and that just shouldn't apply to Christians. And his challenge was rebuffed, and since then, Christians have readily accepted the Old Testament in some form or another as part of our sacred scripture. Um, So, how does the Old Testament apply to us as Christians if we're not Jewish? Is It's a tough question, actually. So, oftentimes, religious communities, denominations will argue about whether specific laws in the Old Testament should apply to today or whether they shouldn't. So, this is still somewhat controversial, and we have to deal with the fact that even though we're not Israelites, that we are also called, similarly called, to be people of God. Um, and if you want to look in the Old or in the New Testament, there are certainly plenty of controversies about Jewish law there. Controversies about circumcision, controversies about purity, and so forth. So this was definitely not something new to Marcion's time. Next topic we want to talk about is the development of lectionaries. So first of all, what is a lectionary? A lectionary is a list of Bible readings assigned to a specific day. And you're probably already aware of this, but each of the readings that are chosen for Sunday worship are part of a pre-prepared list of readings. And if you're doing things right, you should have the same readings as the parish down the road. You will probably have the same readings as the Lutheran Church down the road, and oftentimes you will have the same readings as the Catholic Church down the road. So, specific Bible readings are assigned to specific days in the calendar. And so, a lectionary is just a list of assigned readings. So, lectionaries go back all the way, for sure, to the 5th century. That's probably the oldest lectionary that we have access to, and that happens to be an Armenian lectionary from Jerusalem. And those readings, lists of readings, definitely contain readings from the Old Testament. Here again, particularly emphasizing the prophets, uh, and especially Isaiah. I seem to have been very fond of Isaiah, and also focusing specifically on the Psalms. So here again, we know that the Old Testament was an integral part of early Christian worship. So, however, somewhere around approximately the 7th century, the time of Gregory the Great, the readings, at least for the Mass, were streamlined and uh, there weren't any further readings from the Old Testament at Mass. So you may or may not know that prior to Vatican II and the liturgical reforms of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, prior to that, Mass only had two readings, one from the Epistle and one from the Gospel. So, for a very long period of time, there were no readings from the Old Testament, except on Epiphany, Good Friday, and then the series of readings at the Easter Vigil. So, from around 800 up into the 1970s, a very long time, the lectionary was based on a 1 year cycle of very select gospel readings. So, no readings from the Gospel of Mark because it was felt that those are already incorporated into Matthew, so that's duplicating. And just some very, very select readings, so 52 gospel readings out of the year. Again, around the time of Vatican II, there were significant reforms in the lectionary, and probably some of the most sweeping reforms of Vatican II, if we look at them in retrospect. So, the committee for reforming the lectionary, it's called Coetus 9, uh, came up with a system of a 3 year cycle of gospel readings. So these are year A, year B, and year C, which you may be familiar with. Year A is Matthew, year B is Mark, and year C that we're just finishing up right now is Luke. And then John is interspersed throughout the year, usually on festival days and also in the year when we do Mark, since Mark is a fairly short gospel. So this significantly expanded the number of gospel readings, but also the new lectionary added readings from the Old Testament and added a psalm reading. So that was a significant inclusion of the Old Testament in the new lectionary cycle. So the Episcopal Church adopted a 3 year cycle with the 1979 Book of Common Prayer. So they came up with their own lectionary, although many of the Sundays agree with the Roman Catholic lectionary. So they began with the Roman Catholic lectionary as a model and then developed some modifications, but essentially adopted the same system in the Episcopal Church back in the late 70s. The Old Testament readings, and I also don't know if you're familiar with this, operate under a principle of intertextuality. In other words, if you read the Old Testament reading and then you hear the gospel reading, oftentimes there is some sort of a connection between those two texts. Either a word or phrase, significant word or phrase, are repeated in the New Testament from the Old Testament, or there is a common idea that's shared between the two, but usually there's some sort of a connection. Every once in a while, it's hard to figure out exactly what they were thinking when they were making that connection, but usually it's pretty apparent what it is that they're getting at. So people talk about this as intertextuality, or showing the fact that the Old Testament and the New Testament are not just two completely foreign books, but they're actually very closely related. And that's an idea that was lost for many centuries, or not fully realized at least. This expansion of the readings for Sunday worship gave a much greater exposure of the church to the Old Testament. So I would say people now are at least quite a bit more familiar with the people and the readings from the Old Testament than they would have been, say, 50 years ago. So that's definitely an advancement. One could argue, for good or ill, that this sort of creates a canon within a canon. So if you have 52 readings times a reading from the Psalms, a reading from the Old Testament, and a reading from the Epistle times 3 years, that maybe within the entire lectionary that this is more or less um, all of the important readings that there are in the Bible. And you could maybe make that argument. On the other hand, if you added them all up together, we still only hear approximately 25% of the entire Bible um, on Sunday morning during worship. Now, we hear a huge percentage. I think it's between 70 and 80% of the New Testament, but not nearly as large a percentage of the Old Testament. As we mentioned a number of weeks ago, that since the Reformation, um, people have looked at the Old Testament more in terms of doing plain readings of the text, and thus some parts of the Old Testament are just not that appropriate for worship on Sunday morning. So you probably wouldn't have somebody get up and read the first 9 chapters of the first book of Chronicles, for example, because it's all genealogy, or maybe some of the more gruesome parts of the Old Testament you might say are not, or I think you would say, are not appropriate for worship. So, in a sense, we have identified, I think, through this process, the most significant parts of both the Old and the New Testament, at least in terms of how they relate um, to their appropriateness for worship on a Sunday morning. Other churches developed what is known as the Revised Common Lectionary. And again, these are churches like the Lutheran Church, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, um, the UCC Church, Methodists use the Revised Common Lectionary, at least some of them. Some uh, Presbyterians use the Revised Common Lectionary. Again, they started with the Catholic lectionary as a model and then modified it for their own uses. So a similar model as was developed by the Roman Catholics and by the Episcopal Church. And you should know that the Episcopal Church has adopted the Revised Common Lectionary in 2006. And again, there weren't a lot of differences between the lectionary that's in the prayer book and the Revised Common Lectionary, but you should also be aware that the Episcopal Church now follows the Revised Common Lectionary, at least since 2006. Wanted to also talk a bit about the effect of biblical scholarship on how the Old Testament is viewed in the church. And one of the first and most important things I wanted to say is that studies into the historical Jesus, or historical critical studies, have helped the church understand that Jesus was Jewish. And to us today, that may not come as much of a shock, but um, people for many centuries didn't really think of Jesus in terms of his historical context. So the Old Testament provides us a lot of information about what things were like in the time of Jesus, common beliefs, customs, practices, and so forth. So biblical scholarship has made the Old Testament much more important in the life of the church because it brings us um, good historical information on Israelite culture and things that would have been around affecting ideas at the time of Jesus. So, increased understanding of the Old Testament has created greater insights into some of the issues discussed in the New Testament, and I already mentioned some of these, like purity and food laws, circumcision, which Paul spends a great deal of time talking about, and other customs and practices we find in the New Testament. So, again, the realization now is that there is a big connection between the Old Testament and the New Testament, and understanding one is important for understanding the other. And I just want to close this section with a quote from St. Jerome that you probably have heard, is that ignorance of Scripture is ignorance of Christ. In other words, we can't ignore the Old Testament, even if all we're interested in really is Jesus. The Old Testament brings a lot to bear in terms of understanding the person of Jesus and his historical context, which again we see as a much more important item in understanding our church and understanding our faith. Thanks so much.